It's coming in at the moment. Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the History Homecoming Webinar Series 2023. Kia ora. To celebrate the University of Canterbury's 150th anniversary, the Department of History is welcoming back and honouring the diversity of our graduates from across the decades. Ko Katie Pickles tōku ingoa. I'm going to be asking our guests about memories of their time as a student, discussing their life since graduating and how history's proved useful, as well as seeking advice for those studying history today and into the future. Our special guest tonight is Matt Frost, QSM. Now, Matt is currently a principal advisor at Whaikaha, which is the first ministry of disabled people in the world. He was previously at the Ministry of Education as a principal advisor, lived experience. Matt has represented Aotearoa New Zealand at the UN by leading preparations for the examination of the New Zealand government on its performance in implementing the UN Human Rights Treaty relating to disabled people. He was there in 2022. Matt's also led preparations for the New Zealand government on its response to that examination and has led New Zealand's international disability engagement preparation. Now, Matt's QSM is for services to people with autism, and he's been an advocate for the rights of disabled people for more than 15 years. He was invited to chair the Implementation Advisory Group for the New Zealand Autism Spectrum Disorder Guideline in 2008, and the guideline was the first in the world to take a whole-of-life view of autism and how to support autistic people to live lives in the community. He was also the deputy chair of the Living Guideline Group that came out of that, a technical advisory group which updated the evidence in the guideline, and he did that until 2020. Now, Matt was also previously a policy advisor, researcher for Autism New Zealand for 3 years. And Matt has a BA Honours from in history from the University of Canterbury. He came to us from Victoria, where he'd done his undergrad. And Matt, I think you've got your medal to show us. Huge congratulations. It's not long since your
somewhere, Katie. I'm just looking for it as it happens.
Ceremony.
I had it before.
We did have it before.
But I'll show you the box.
Here's the box.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
And
Congratulations. I have got it somewhere. So, yes. Which is annoying to me because I just... Oh, here we go. Here
it is.
It slipped down my couch.
Yeah. Fantastic. Congratulations, Matt. Wonderful achievement and recognition of all of the work that you've been doing for at least 15 years, I think we would say. Now, so Matt, first of all, your memories of your time as a student here. You were here in 2003, and I remember the first time I saw you, I poked my head out of my office. I think I was going to get a cup of coffee, and you were walking along the hallway, and you were carrying a great big pile of books. And I think that's how I'll always think of you. You just had this absolute passion for history and reading in the past. So what do you sort of remember from your time?
Look, that's a really interesting question, Katie. But firstly, I'd like to thank you so much for having me and having this series. And what an amazing group of people you've put together. So, look, from my point of view, I was here 20 some years ago, and I have 3 or 4 really strong memories. So, firstly, I remember the hallway. I mean, if you've ever been at the university history department, I remember the long hallway that you went down to go to seminar rooms. And I was really fortunate to we had a fantastic group of history honours graduates who were in my year. So we had people who've gone on to be lecturers in history, they teachers. I think Grace went and did technology stuff. So we did a whole range of stuff. I also remember really distinctly the common room that we had, where there was a range of books and a range of texts from the history department in the 1960s. I suspect the common room was the other excuse for the common room was the library, the old history library. Look, I also I have fond memories of the courses that I did. So Jeff Rice's public history, for example, was extremely useful for me and has been extremely useful in my future career that I've got now, because I think what Jeff invited me to engage with was that actually you can use history outside the academy, and that the range of things you can do with history outside the academy were really strong. I remember history as a discipline, which was the kind of philosophical survey course. And I remember that for a funny reason. I mean, I think methodologically, I was probably a little bit out of sync with Ian Campbell and some other members of the department. But again, that was really interesting because I think I learned from that experience that you can have robust conversations philosophically with people, and still have a level of common respect, right?
Yes.
I think, and certainly for me, that came through the course. I mean, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I happened to be in the year that the Joel Hayward
Yes.
Holocaust thesis stuff
Yes.
happened.
Yes.
That was
Joel
that.
Hayward's flawed
Yeah,
1991
that's right.
EMA
Yeah, that's right.
thesis, probably
That's right.
a dark
And
year
look,
in the history of the department. And yes, there was definitely
look
a lot
at
of opinions going around.
look, it was hard, Katie.
Mm,
If I'm being
mm,
honest, I think for me, I mean, I learned from it as a student, and I think what I learned as a student was that you, and I think what I took away from my later practice was, again, that importance of being able to have robust conversation, but in
mm.
a respectful way.
Respectful way. It was
Um,
definitely a year of robust conversations,
yeah,
and
yeah,
maybe
yeah,
like
that's
none
right.
other in the history of the
That's right.
department. Yes. So,
Yeah.
in your life since graduating, how I know we've thought about this, how studying history might or might not have proved useful. And we've had an introduction to lots of the many things you've done. What sort of skill sets do you think history's given you?
Oh, look, Katie, for me, history has given me a myriad of skill sets. Um, for example, the ability to write. You cannot overestimate that. The ability to be able to marshal your thoughts in a cogent and logical way, and in a way that is attractive to, and comprehensible to other people, is, I know that sounds trite at a base level, but actually it is a surprisingly uncommon skill. And I think history gave me that ability to write. I think in the era, I've been thinking about this, in the era of disinformation,
Mm,
I think what history gives you is the ability to do textual discrimination. And what I mean by that is being able to discern really clearly whether a text or knowledge that you are engaging with has value or not. And I think those are skills that in this age are really, really important.
mm.
Um, I think the other thing that history gave me from a skill-based point of view was the ability to write in different registers. So
Yes.
what I mean by that is the ability to be able to engage and write for different stakeholder groups in different ways.
Mhm.
And I guess one of the things that I would say about the skills that I learned, and one of the learnings I think from my earlier life is we think a lot and we connect a lot with grades at particularly undergraduate level, I think. And I guess what I would say to future students is, look, grades are important, don't get me wrong. I mean, I think they are a marker of the way in which you've learned and assimilated knowledge in a course. But I guess my advice to students would be, really think about the skills that you're learning and concentrate on those skills. And unlike when I was at university, I think that departments and universities are getting much more attuned now about telling you what skills you are learning. So in course outlines that I've seen of courses of late, and I don't know, I presume Canterbury does the same, they lay out what are the skills you can be expected to learn. And I'd invite future learners to really focus on those things, because they're the skills in the job market that will be really attractive. The other thing I would say is the ability to learn, and this is interesting, particularly for people with autism, but the ability to learn soft skills. So that ability to be able to work with others on a common problem is a really, really useful skill in the job market. So, and all of those things history teaches you.
Yes. No, that's great. All of those skills, those transferable skills, discerning between different sources, like you've said, especially in an age of fake news and information, and when there's so much information out there. So those are really great insights. Thanks, Matt. Now, in your work, you've been doing all sorts of work where you put those skills into practice, and it's going to be really fantastic to hear a little bit more, if we can, about, I know you were in New York recently at the UN, and you've been to Japan in the past, and Geneva, and you're often representing Aotearoa New Zealand on the world stage that way. And so yeah, what's important there when you're doing it? What are some of the experiences you've had?
Look,
getting your perspective across.
That's a really cool question, Katie. And I think one of the things, I mean, there's lots of different things in those kind of international contexts where history has been extremely helpful for me. I think the first is, you get a sense if you have a sense of history and international history and politics, you can really connect much more easily with those environments. So for example, recently going to the UN for the Conference of States Parties that I went to, you having a sense of why the UN runs the way it does. So for example, the fact that the Security Council has its Big Five that was selected in 1945, and they have particular rights within the United Nations. So for example, there's quite strict time limits on speeches, and I had to write a speech for our chief executive that was 3 minutes in length, and trying to write a speech that's 3 minutes and says something beyond "hello, this is who I am" is quite tricky. But again, it was really interesting, like listening to speeches from the Russian Federation, who clearly are not sending Christmas cards to the United Nations. But I mean, I think the other thing that I would say in that kind of international context is that it's very hard to do that work without context. And a history degree gives you a deep understanding and a deep appreciation of different contexts. And again, I mean, the history of the United Nations is really interesting. So, and you get a sense of what social change happens, right? So at the United Nations, there is a room, a very nice big room, is the wand of the United Nations, called the Trusteeship Council. And the Trusteeship Council is a fascinating space. It's a lovely room, but there is no more trusteeship anymore. Trusteeship was a concept that was done in the 1940s, where bigger powers basically ruled over smaller ones. And New Zealand had trusteeship territories. So, for example, Samoa was a trusteeship territory, and there are no more trusteeships. They still have the room, and the room is a lovely place to go and have meetings and stuff. But I think for me as a historian, I had a sense of what the room meant, right? Whereas I think other colleagues, this was just a nice kind of ornate room to hang out in, right?
Yes.
And for me, knowing that history of trusteeship in an interesting kind of way helps me in terms of thinking about social change,
Yes.
because it reminds me that social change is very possible, and it's the stuff that I do every other day, really, for disabled people. And sometimes when that social change, on days when that is hard, right, and you think this is too hard, right, going back to historical contexts, such as the trusteeship stuff, such as the suffrage movement, right, is really, really helpful.
Yes.
So I guess I know that's probably a roundabout way of answering your
That's
question,
fascinating.
but yeah.
You're sort of walking, living history, reading the past, reading the landscape for its past when you're at the United Nations there, and having to say things very quickly. Is it quite nerve-wracking, or do you
It's very nerve-wracking. Very
Yeah.
nerve-wracking.
No,
Yeah. And it's even nerve-wracking even if you're not speaking, but you've prepared the stuff, because at the UN they literally have a clock that counts down, right? So I know for me, as I was hearing our chief executive speak, I was kind of looking at the clock because they cut you off. They like literally, if you go over the 3 minutes, they cut you off. So if students think that lecturers are being really hard if they give them extra 2 minutes, honestly, at the UN, if you go 5 seconds over time, they cut you off.
That's it. You're done. Yeah,
absolutely.
You're done.
And it doesn't. And the fascinating thing is, it doesn't matter if you are a minister. It doesn't matter if you're a head of state. They still cut you off, which is really fascinating. It's very egalitarian, but it's still quite weird.
And very, very harsh. Yeah, you really have to be on top of your game, as of course you are. And Matt, how do you think Aotearoa New Zealand's doing? When it comes, because we've got the first ministry for disabled people in the world. That sounds. How are we?
That's a really interesting question, Katie, and I guess I'm going to answer it in two ways, if I may. I mean, I think I would be lying if I said that life is absolutely stellar for disabled people in New Zealand. I mean, so what we know, for example, is that it doesn't matter what disability you might have, disabled people tend to be at the lower end of key social indicators and social markers that we care about in New Zealand. For example, education, employment, standards of living. So look, I'm always mindful of that. I guess what I am proud of in the New Zealand context is that we have recognised that disability is not just a health issue. It's an issue that crosses all social and governmental domains. And so, for example, if you can I mean, the health of disabled people and well-being of disabled people is incredibly important. And if you don't give disabled people good quality education, for example. And I mean, look, that, just to be really clear, I mean, that can look very different, right? For different people.
Yes.
And I think it is, I mean, one of the things that I say at work is that disability is one of the most complex areas of social policy you will ever work with, because it has lots of philosophical and ethical and competing interests, right?
Yes.
So, for example, how do we make sure it's not as easy as just saying, well, we will value disabled people's lives? I mean, you know yourself, right? There are concerns for carers and loved ones of disabled people. So I think on one level, I would say New Zealand, look, we've still got a long way to go. I think what the ministry does is gives a focal point, and we can we govern $2 billion worth of support services, but also we do what we call a stewardship role, so working across government. I think in the international context, it's also a little bit strange, because I guess we are seen as a world leader in this space, which might seem a bit oxymoronic given what I've just said. But I think we are seen as a world leader in the space because we have tried to see it as a more social question. But what I also always remind my colleagues is that we're seen as strong internationally because it's a low bar internationally.
Yes.
And ironically, that gives me a strong motivation to do the work that I do,
Yes.
because I want to see other disabled people have the life outcomes that all New Zealanders aspire to.
Yes.
And so I think for me, and as a disabled person myself, it's something that I'm really personally passionate
Yes.
about.
Yes. Definitely.
So look, I think overall I would say that we have parts of our record we can be really proud of, but there's still lots of stuff we can do. One thing I will say though, Katie, is that I think one of the things I became really aware of in the UN context was that how contested and somewhat fraught the wider human rights conversation is. So, for example, I'm really proud of the fact that we got a topic for debate at the conference I was recently at on sexual and reproductive health for disabled women and girls. And that's a really key health question for all
Yes.
girls and women, as you know. But it's particularly acute for disabled women and girls. And I'm proud of the fact that we got that on the agenda, because there was some strong opposition to that. And so I guess that also reminded me that we need to cherish the human rights frameworks that we do have.
Yes.
And history is really helpful with that, because that gives you an understanding of the evolution of human rights.
Yes. No, definitely. And is it true, Matt? I think you were telling me that the first person diagnosed with autism has just passed on.
Yes, that's true. So so he was a man named Donald Triplett, and he lives in a small town in the US. And the interesting thing about autism, as you know, Katie, is that autism, there has been a seeming explosion in diagnosis, I think one of the things that's really that the recent death of Donald Triplett reminded me is that actually autism as a diagnostic category is quite new, right? So in it came along in the 1940s, and it was developed in the 1940s. And interestingly, and you'll resonate with this given your areas of interest from a history point of view, the interesting thing was the diagnosis came about because Donald's mother, he was about 6 or 7, and she took him to one of America's leading child psychologists, Leo Kanner. And Kanner was reluctant to label Donald, but the interesting thing about that was that he'd already, at the age of 6, had a period in an institution. And the reason why he'd had a period in an institution was because she took him along to his GP, and his GP immediately knew what the problem was, Katie. The problem was his mother.
Yeah.
His
Oh, of
mother was,
course. Yes.
his mother was
Oh, mother,
overprotective.
yes.
So it was really interesting because what that, and the other thing that's really interesting about that Donald story for me was the life he was able to construct for himself with support. So he went to university, he worked in a bank for 60 years, those kind of core human things that we all value for all humans.
Yes.
And I guess we still have this really tricky space in disability, I think, around the diagnostic and tying quite closely to diagnostic categories. And I guess one of the things that I've tried to do in my work is do a balance of that the clinical knowledge is really important, but also the social determinants and dynamics around disability are just as important.
Yes.
And I guess that's why I'm proud of the ministry, because the ministry tries to go beyond the purely diagnostic and says actually what makes up a good life for somebody who, and also their family, their whānau, their carers, those who support them. So yeah.
So and of course your historical imagination gives you that whole history of the evolution of categories and disabilities and processes and institutions and judgments and all sorts of areas.
The interesting thing, sorry, just really quickly, the interesting thing around that work at the moment is, of course, some listeners and some viewers may know of the Royal Commission of onto Abuse and Care. And I think that's a really important area of untapped history, because I think, and look, the stories that are already being shared in that space are really tough and really troubling, but I think they add to a richer historical picture for us in New Zealand, because I think they, and what I hope is that the Royal Commission as a vehicle is a useful one, I think, because those stories are able to be shared and told, but then the next part of it is, well, what are we going to do about that? What are we going to do to make sure that the practices that happened in a in that space don't happen again? Because actually it would be really disrespectful to those people who shared that experience to not do something with it.
Yes, the intention for a better future. That definitely is the motivation behind a lot of the testimony. Matt, it's your work, and you do such fantastic work. You're so brave. I mean, we're really getting at very difficult topics in history, isn't it? And like you've said, that's what we do as historians. We ask questions. We ask the hard questions. We try and come up with the best answers we can based on all the different sorts of evidence we can, and put it all together. But it's pretty tough stuff. Definitely important.
And I think what I would say to history students or people thinking about the discipline is that that I like the phrase you just used before, the historical imagination, right? Which is a really imagining yourself in the past. I know was extremely helpful for me as someone with my impairment, because one of the clinical diagnoses of autism is we're not supposed to be into imagination, right? But there are different forms of imagination,
Absolutely.
and I think transposing yourself and being able to transpose yourself into the thoughts of another was a skill that was extremely useful for me as I grew up and as I developed. I think the important thing that history taught me was it was able to discipline that imagination into okay, so how do you make that into a cogent, give it a cogent sense, and actually also what do you want to do with that information, and what do you want to do with that imagination?
Yes. Yep.
I think one thing that history also taught me was the importance of not being presentist. That it's really important that you judge historical contexts on their merits. And given what we've just talked about in terms of the Royal Commission, I mean, I think one of the challenges for the Royal Commission is going to be how it evaluates with social norms that it has now. That said, history can teach you that, right?
Yes.
It gives you skills to go, okay. And actually, what I've said to members of that commission, because I know a couple of the Royal Commissioners, is I've said to them, look, there were standards in the past that were breached, and so that even in the past, you could say people were being a bit, you know what I mean? So
there are always voices of dissent in the past. There are always multiple voices, aren't there?
Absolutely.
Yeah, there are always counter narratives. It's always complex, but people who don't study history perhaps don't think that.
Yes.
There's always one view, but it's absolutely the case, isn't it? History it's difficult. Matt, thank you very, very much for coming home to history. It's been an absolute pleasure to welcome you home. Your homecoming.
It's been my absolute delight.
So proud of you and appreciate all of your wisdom tonight. And thank you so much. And we'll be watching very carefully and with great interest to see where you're heading next, because
Thanks,
you're
Katie.
always so busy. And make sure you take some time out to watch some cricket.
I will. I will. And can I just encourage people? Look, I mean what I say, that the range of participants in this forum that you've brought together, an amazing group of people, and I'm gonna slip into a couple of the sessions, I think, because I mean, just an amazing group of alumni. And look, I really wish this project well in terms of the richness that it brings out. And
well, thank you.
It's been a pleasure to be part of it.
Well, thank you for going first as well, and thank you for being part of it and coming home. And it's been great chatting, having a conversation with you. So go well, and ka kite.
Mā te wā.